Thanks very much. So we're here this morning representing the civil society participation in this very important national process, international process of coming together with finance ministers this weekend leading up to the global leaders of the G20 at a time when I think we all recognise that we are facing some very significant global challenges and that we have a shared interest and desire for this process of the G20 to be a serious success. I think globally we recognise that there are real issues for populations in terms of sense of hope, in terms of sense of security, in a sense of being able to participate in the big challenges that we all share together. So for the C20, we were very keen to come to the table with leaders to make it very clear that we accept our responsibility to be a part of designing the solutions for the global challenges that we face, and to bring a message to the leaders that it is their responsibility to ensure that we can do this work together. I think there's a recognition that the G20 faces a challenge in terms of legitimacy. We as a civil society absolutely recognise the importance of solid economic growth, and we do support the position of the Australian presidency in pursuing a clear growth target. But with a recognition through the G20 already that growth is not for growth's sake, that growth does need to be done in a way that is inclusive. And what we mean by that globally is that we must ensure that the people who have the least, the people on the lowest incomes, are the ones that are the most important when it comes to delivering on the economic, social and environmental outcomes from economic growth. And so we are certainly looking to the leaders to commit to work on an appropriate measure of how to reduce inequality. We believe that we should have a focus on a commensurate growth in the incomes of households in the bottom 20%. So if we're pursuing a 2% growth target, then we should be looking to pursue, at the minimum, in terms of an outcome, a growth in the income levels of the same percentage point. I think also civil society is very keen to ensure that growth is jobs rich. Now, for us to deliver on that, we need, and we've heard this in the dialogue this morning, we need to ensure that nations coming to the table with their growth plans have a strong focus on how to open up job opportunities and how to ensure that there are real jobs delivered out of the growth agenda. Now, we believe that this is a perfect example of how this cannot be delivered by only designing growth strategies through the political process by the politicians or only in partnership with the business communities. We need to have an inclusive process of policy design. So that means civil society organisations working directly with the governments and with the business groups and also the unions about what national plans of economic growth should look like, including how to open up those job opportunities. Importantly for civil society, we believe that climate change must be a core purpose of the G20. We cannot separate out this global challenge from the core agenda of the G20 when it comes to economic growth, and we'll be very keen to see where the leaders end up in terms of their position on this vital global challenge for all of us. The question of infrastructure investment has been a big theme so far in the meetings to date in Cairns. For the civil society, this is a very important part of the agenda where I think the political environment can often see infrastructure development as being one of political risk, that historically poor project design, poor project implementation has led to significant community dissent and very poor social and environmental outcomes. We can change that if we are prepared to work together. Civil society organisations and leaders want to be at the table from the beginning of project design, project selection, the building up of the pipeline, the machinery associated with governance over infrastructure investment, the marking out of what should be the core economic, social and environmental outcomes of specific projects, and making sure that we can work together on transparency and confidence that this is a good value project for business, for the political environment, and also for the broader community. Finally, I want to highlight that we absolutely have a shared agenda around addressing the base erosion and profit shifting deep problem that is right across the globe. We congratulate the G20 for expressing this as one of its core purposes, that it must continue to demonstrate its determination to tackle how to make sure that each nation and across the globe we have confidence in the taxation system, we have confidence that it's delivering in terms of sustainable revenue bases for nation states, and that the general public, the community, have a real confidence that we are all paying our fair share of tax. There is no division here between us in what we want to achieve out of the BEPS process. We believe that civil society has a core role to play, both in making sure that implementation is successful, that at the national level and globally we keep the political pressure where it needs to be to make sure that we don't pull back from this agenda. And obviously also we believe that transparency out of where corporations are not paying their fair share, the broader public has a key role to play there in putting the consumer pressure on those corporations to make sure that we are all contributing to the tax base on a fair and equitable basis around the globe. So there is a lot of common ground here, but I think that there's a recognition from us that we are at a turning point when it comes to confidence in the G20 process, and obviously we believe that by us coming together, civil society organisations, political leaders, business leaders, youth and the labour organisations, we have a real chance of sharing the responsibility if we're prepared to open up the mechanisms for that to be done. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I said to the finance ministers, the world is falling apart. The sense of fear is overwhelming hope. The forces of fragmentation are great, and yet the challenges that face us cannot be solved by any one of the 200 sovereign nations. The challenges from terror to illicit movement of money, at least 40 billion a year coming out of Africa, tax avoidance and evasion, the climate change agenda can only be solved by global governance. So G20 remains the best hope, the one hope. If it fails, where do we turn? And I think, as Cass has indicated, there was response certainly from the French Foreign Finance Minister and the South African Finance Minister affirming this has to be inclusive growth. If it's growth that just actually transfers into profits, not jobs, not including young people and women, growth that goes to the top 1%, what good is that? We often, when we say growth, assume jobs. Often growth means profits, and you don't hear that word said, and who does that actually go to? And we made a very strong point that to build trust, because G20 now has a trust credibility issue, particularly if the 2% growth target above trend isn't realised, to have legitimacy in a fragmenting world, the simplest thing they could do is actually unequivocally commit to transparency. Transparency around who's paying tax and who isn't, the BEPS agenda, the automatic tax indexation. Transparency builds trust. Transparency around open government and open data. Transparency builds trust. And the forces of fragmentation are very, very great, and this is a threshold moment really for the world, given if global governance here fails, where we turn to.
Could I just ask, you were putting some positions to the G20 finance ministers, and you want the G20 leaders to take them up. But are you getting any feedback about whether they will, and particularly on the issues of distribution, about whether you can get a more nuanced commitment on the 2% growth target for different income groups?
Certainly the indications we've had from the discussion this morning with the finance ministers was that we seem to be getting a very clear confirmation that growth needs to be inclusive. Now that was firmly established at the Russian presidency last year, and we are certainly expecting that will once again be affirmed in the leaders' communique, particularly in light of how that was expressed through the employment minister's process, and now obviously we'll wait to see what the communique does say from the finance ministers later on. But we are certainly expecting to see a confirmation of that commitment. I think the second question about the mechanism by which the G20 will ensure that in fact growth is inclusive, including what kind of other target might be set to make sure that there is the appropriate sharing of the benefits, and we have a particular eye to people on the lowest incomes, those who have the least. We are certainly proposing a target, which is, as I indicated, the commensurate increase in the income levels of the lowest 20% of households, but we don't have any indication at the moment whether that will be taken up.
I think the Labor ministers certainly had a communique, and we presented there around this has to be job-rich growth, not jobless growth. And certainly a very strong statement around child labour, 168 million children in child labour, modern-day slavery. And yes, that produces greater profits and even lower consumer prices, but supply chain standardisation cannot be just for lower costs. It actually has to get children whose lives are being destroyed out of slavery. So that was something we hope to see in the final communique. And there were lots of nods around the room when we said inequality at the moment. 85 individuals have a wealth equal to the bottom 3.2 billion of the world's poor. You can't just argue equality of opportunity as if everyone's at the same starting line and some are faster and smarter and get ahead. Lots of the world's poor who are looking at the G20 are nowhere near the starting line of others in education, in health. So inclusive growth has to look at social infrastructure, not just hard infrastructure, and certainly not hard infrastructure that seizes land from the poor and water supplies without community engagement.
David Crowe from the Australian newspaper. A broader question for both of you. You've set out some ambitious requirements for the G20 this year, but I got into a conversation with a G20 critic at the pub last night, and my question is perhaps looking backwards a bit. When you think about what the G20 has talked about in the last 2 or 3 years since the global financial crisis, what would you give the G20 out of 10 in terms of actually doing stuff? You know, it's important for you to comment on what you think should be addressed this weekend, but when you look back, can you nominate anything that the G20 has done in recent years that you think is actually an achievement?
So the fact that you have had a commitment to inclusive growth that came out of St. Petersburg that's getting affirmed here, I think is a beacon of hope. But we made a very strong statement this morning that implementation has really been problematic. And that's why the G20's credibility is on the line. So it's 5 out of 10 at the moment. It had a burning platform when the global financial crisis hit, and it acted. That was its glory moment. Since then, it has been more aspirational statements than achievements and implementation. And even with the things we're now applauding, automatic tax information exchange and the BEPS process, the devil is going to be in implementation. That's actually the big challenge. And we said there, you shouldn't be talking about success halfway to success even until you've started implementing. And the trust deficit only widens when you have aspirational statements and you don't implement. So that's why there was a very strong statement from us. We will partner with you. We'll give you cover in civil society to say, you know, you're going the right direction if you act. That's the big question, the acting and the implementing.
I guess what I would add to the rating from Tim is that there has been an increasing recognition from I think from nation states generally, that we are recognising there is a gap between those who understand that sometimes change requires sustained and very difficult work, particularly when you're trying to reform global systems, but also that at the state level, at the nation level, there is a real deficit in terms of confidence from the public in the political processes. This is very real, and Australia is I think, just a case in point on that front. So there is a real risk for the G20 leaders that if we continue to have good rhetoric, but there are not very tangible, visible actions taken, and with a sense of deep urgency, that problem will overwhelm the process and it will unravel at a time when we know that there does need to be some sustained work done on quite technical issues to make sure that we get the reforms that we need. So the best example for me is that I don't think there is any excuse for Australia to not be an early adopter when it comes to the BEPS process. We have widely recognised around the globe as having one of the healthiest financial institution systems. Our banks are doing very well. There is no excuse for us not to be leading in a big way in that area. And so I'd certainly be questioning why we might be to create that sense of uncertainty about timetabling of this work, particularly when at the national level, the Australian government is saying that we have a revenue problem. Well, if we have a revenue problem, this is a perfect opportunity for us to go very hard and quickly with a sense of urgency so that the government is able to say to the Australian public, we are working on our front to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share.
I would add to that the debate has often been austerity versus growth, and the truth is, I think the Australian government has largely thought we have a spending problem rather than a revenue problem. I think what Cass has said is really important to say, actually, this is a revenue problem, not just a spending problem. You can't have austerity and cutting to get your way out of this. And the point we're making generally of the G20 is certainly true of Australia. If there is a lack of trust, when governments need to ask the electorate for legitimate sacrifices, they can't actually get them through because we don't trust them. We actually need the G20 level and government level to rebuild that trust, and that comes with explaining its revenue and spending and transparency, and we're in this together.
Well, from the Financial Review, there's a lot of talk in the business community, particularly the financial part of the sector part of the business community, about financial inclusion these days. It was a subject at the finance ministers' meeting back in February. So, are you on do you have much of a unity sort of ticket in dealing with this in terms of the communique and the way the finance ministers work? And did that occur in the meeting this morning, or are you pursuing this very much individually from the community sector perspective?
Certainly through the C20, the civil society process, this issue has been raised, and there's a recognition that the reforms needed to address that are very diverse across different sort of in terms of the national context in which you're working. I think what we'd say though is that we made a very clear decision as this is only the second time that the civil society engagement group has been formally a part of this process. and that we are very serious about making sure that we focus on some core issues that we think present deep global challenges and big global risks for us. And so that is why you will hear that in the time that we have to interact with the finance ministers and to urge for progress to be made, we have focused on jobs, growth, the deep concerns around climate change, with the Australian presidency and the finance ministers clearly agitated about the financing of infrastructure, where we believe civil society has a core role to play with that, and the destruction that can come from very poorly designed and implemented infrastructure projects. We have far too many tragic stories around the globe on that front. The broader question of overall governance and the machinery through which financial reforms are made. So we are not dismissing the issue that you raise, but certainly we had to make some calls about where we would really focus our effort, and we certainly expect to see progress on each of these fronts.
I think I can confidently say we have a unity ticket on financial inclusion. The truth is, in most low-income countries, that is really a profoundly key issue because of the informal sector, where people literally can't get any work, and that's why they're not paying any tax. There's no recognition of any rights because they don't have access to finance. And we certainly believe that governments which are broke and are saying to business, just tell us whatever your cost is to get you investing private capital, isn't enough without financial inclusion reform that particularly targets natural entrepreneurs, women, for example, in informal sectors that are locked out.
No more questions at the moment. Tim and Cassandra will be around. We're not heading straight off, so if anyone's one-on-one, just let me know. Joanne?